I'm a wildlife photographer and filmmaker. I've spent years documenting nature in all its glory, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff, but this is different. I'm not even sure how to process what I found. I was on the Appalachian Trail in northern Georgia, setting up trail cameras to document deer migration patterns. This is something I've done for years. It's routine for me. I usually choose remote locations where human traffic is minimal to avoid interference. This trip started out like any other, peaceful, productive, and uneventful. I set up 6 trail cameras over a span of 2 miles, focusing on game trails and water sources where deer are most likely to pass. The cameras were motion activated with night vision capabilities and set to record 30-second clips along with still images. Once everything was in place, I planned to leave the cameras for a week before returning to collect the footage. When I returned to retrieve the SD cards, everything seemed normal at first. All the cameras were in place, no signs of tampering or damage. It wasn't until I got back home and started reviewing the footage that things took a turn. The first couple of clips were standard: deer grazing, raccoons scuttling around, and even a black bear sniffing one of the cameras. But then, I noticed something unusual in the background of one of the clips. It was faint, almost easy to miss, but there was a tall, shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by trees. It was upright, taller than any human I've ever seen, and had a strange, unnatural posture. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or a tree trunk, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I moved on to the next set of clips. The same figure appeared again, this time closer to the camera. It was still mostly in the shadows, but you could see its outline more clearly. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, and its proportions were off. What really disturbed me was that there were hikers in the shot, walking along the trail, completely unaware of the thing in the background. I paused the video and zoomed in on the figure. Its head was slightly tilted, as if it was watching the hikers. There was no face, just a dark void where its features should have been. By this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. I've encountered predators in the wild, but this wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. I kept going through the footage, and with each new clip, the figure seemed to get closer to the hikers. In one clip, it was crouching behind a tree, just a few yards away from a group of 3 hikers who had stopped to rest. They were laughing, completely oblivious to the thing just behind them. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I realized how close it was. The next few clips were even worse. The figure started moving, it was walking upright, but its movements were jerky, almost unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking that way. In one shot, it was partially hidden behind a rock, its elongated arm reaching out toward a lone hiker who had fallen behind his group. Then came the final clip. This one, I can barely think about it without feeling sick. The camera had captured a single hiker walking alone down the trail. The figure was directly behind him, maybe 5 feet away. Its arm was outstretched, and you could see these long, claw-like fingers reaching for the hiker's shoulder. And then the camera died. I've never had one of my cameras shut off like that before. The battery was fully charged when I set it up, and the SD card still had plenty of space. It just stopped. I don't know what to make of this. I've shown the footage to a few close friends, and they're just as disturbed as I am. Some of them think it's a hoax or a prank, but I know what I saw. I've gone through the footage dozens of times, and it's real. I've thought about going back to the trail to investigate, but I'm honestly too scared. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there. I don't know what this thing is, but if you're planning to hike the Appalachian Trail, please be careful. Alright, so this happened last fall while I was hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail through Western Virginia. I've told this story to a few friends since, but it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Maybe putting it here will help me make sense of it, or at least convince me I'm not crazy. I'd been on the trail solo for about 2 weeks. I'm no expert hiker, but I've done a few decent stretches of the AT over the years. That day, I was aiming to hit a shelter marked on my map as Cedar Ridge Shelter. The weather was decent in the morning, but by mid-afternoon, the sky turned dark, and it started pouring. The rain was relentless, one of those cold, soaking rains that chills you to the bone no matter what gear you have. When I finally reached Cedar Ridge Shelter, I was beyond relieved. It wasn't huge, just your typical 3-sided log structure with a slanted roof and a fire pit out front. What caught me off guard was the soft glow of a lantern coming from inside. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be there, given how rough the weather had gotten. As I approached, I heard voices, a man and a woman, chatting and laughing. I called out a friendly hello, and the voices paused. Then an older man stepped out, smiling warmly. He looked to be in his late 60s or early 70s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a wool sweater that seemed way too nice for a rainy hike. "Come on in. You must be freezing," he said, waving me in. Inside, a small woman, probably the same age, was stirring something in a pot on a small camping stove. She had silver hair pinned back in a bun and wore a long, old-fashioned skirt paired with a blouse. I remember thinking how odd it was to see such outdated clothing on the trail, but I figured maybe they were just eccentric. They introduced themselves as Walter and Margaret, and they couldn't have been kinder. Margaret insisted I sit by their lantern to warm up while Walter handed me a tin cup of coffee. They had an air about them, like one of those couples you'd meet at a B&B, not on a rugged trail. We spent the evening talking. They said they used to hike the AT together every summer, but hadn't been able to for a long time because of health issues. This trip, they said, was their last hurrah before retiring from the trail for good. Margaret shared stories about the trail back in the 60s and 70s, how different it was then, less crowded, fewer shelters. Walter laughed about getting caught in a storm once and having to charm a farmer into letting them sleep in a barn. Their stories were great, but a few things felt off. For one, they didn't have much modern gear. Their packs were old canvas-style ones with leather straps, and their stove looked like something out of an army surplus catalog. They also made a lot of dated references, like Margaret talking about the young folks these days and how rock and roll just isn't what it used to be. I chalked it up to them being old-school hikers. During dinner, they offered me some stew they'd made, and it was honestly the best thing I'd eaten in days. I didn't have the heart to tell them I'd already set up my own food. We stayed up a while longer, chatting before they turned in. Walter said goodnight, and also said safe travels tomorrow. And Margaret smiled, adding, "Don't let the trail take your spirit." The next morning, I woke up to find their side of the shelter empty. I figured they'd gotten an early start. There was no trace of their gear or even footprints in the muddy trail leading away from the shelter. I assumed the rain had washed them out. At the next town, I stopped in at an outfitter's store to resupply and grab a hot meal. While I was there, I remembered Walter and Margaret. They had given me an address to send a postcard once I finished my hike, something they said they liked to collect from hikers they'd met over the years. Curious, I asked the guy at the store if he knew the couple. When I mentioned Cedar Ridge Shelter, his face fell. "That shelter burned down years ago," he said. I laughed, thinking he must be mistaken. "No, I stayed there last night. It's still standing." He shook his head. "It burned down in 1983. Lightning strike. Killed an older couple who'd been staying there." I felt my stomach drop. "Do you know their names?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He looked it up in a dusty binder of local trail history and found a newspaper clipping. There it was. "Elderly couple perishes in Cedar Ridge shelter fire." The photo showed Walter and Margaret smiling just as I'd seen them. I didn't know what to do with myself. I left the store in a daze and sat on a bench outside, staring at the clipping I'd taken a picture of on my phone. Every detail checked out: their faces, their names, even the little tin coffee cups I'd drunk from. To this day, I have no explanation. I try to tell myself it was just a really vivid dream, or that I imagined their faces matching the article. But I know what I saw, what I ate, and the warmth I felt sitting with them that night. What happened to me and my dog, Scout, still keeps me up at night. I've been hiking for years, and I've always thought the scariest things out there were bears or bad weather. Turns out I was way off. This happened last fall when I took Scout on a weekend trip to the Mount Rogers area. Scout's a German Shepherd, real smart and always full of energy. He loves the outdoors, and he's usually more excited than I am to hit the trails. We've hiked all over, and I've never seen him act like this before. The first day started normal enough. We parked at a trailhead I'd been to a few times before, got our packs on, and set off. The leaves were just starting to turn, so the forest had that perfect mix of color and crisp air. Scout was his usual self, trotting ahead, sniffing everything, and occasionally darting into the bushes after a squirrel. About an hour in, he started acting strange. We were walking down a part of the trail that's pretty open, with a clear view of the trees on either side. All of a sudden, Scout froze. He just stopped dead in his tracks, ears up, staring at this one spot off to the side of the trail. I looked, but there was nothing there. No animals, no movement, just trees and rocks. "Come on, boy," I said, but he wouldn't budge. He just stood there, growling low in his throat like he was warning something off. I've never seen him act like that before. I finally had to tug on his leash to get him to move. He kept looking back over his shoulder, though, like he expected something to jump out at us. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he smelled a coyote or something. But then it happened again and again. Every couple of miles, Scout would stop and stare at these random spots on the trail. Sometimes he'd growl, sometimes he'd just whine, but he always looked like he was seeing something I couldn't. At one point, he even barked, which he almost never does unless there's a reason. The weirdest part was that every time he acted like that, I'd look around and find something. A shoe half buried in the dirt, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. Once, I found an old, rusted water bottle with initials scratched into it. At first, I didn't think much of it. The Appalachian Mountains see a lot of hikers, and people are always losing stuff. But the more it happened, the more it started to feel wrong. Like these weren't just random things people had dropped. By the time we set up camp for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Scout wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing around the campsite, sniffing the air and staring out into the darkness. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, it got worse. We were hiking up a ridge when Scout froze again, this time right in the middle of the trail. He was staring at this big boulder off to the side, growling like crazy. I walked over to check it out, and that's when I saw it, a hiking boot sticking out from under the rock. I thought maybe it was just trash, but when I pulled it out, I realized it wasn't empty. There was a foot inside. I'm not proud of this, but I screamed. I stumbled back, dragging Scout with me, and nearly tripped over my own feet. My first thought was to call the cops, but there was no cell service out there. I didn't know what else to do, so I marked the spot with a piece of cloth from my pack and hightailed it back to the trailhead. Scout was practically dragging me the whole way, like he couldn't wait to get out of there. When I got back to my car, I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what I'd found. They sent a team out to investigate, and a few days later, I got a call from one of the rangers. Turns out the boot belonged to a hiker who went missing over 10 years ago. They found more remains buried under the boulder, along with a backpack and some other personal items. Here's the thing though. When the rangers went back to check the other spots I'd marked where Scout had acted weird, they found more stuff. A torn jacket that matched the description of another missing hiker, a pocket knife engraved with initials, even a skull partially buried in the dirt. All in all, they linked the sites to 6 different hikers who'd vanished over the past decade. I don't know how Scout knew where to stop or why he acted the way he did. I've heard stories about dogs sensing things humans can't, but this was on another level. It's like he could see the people who went missing, like their spirits were still there, trying to be found. I haven't been back to Mount Rogers since, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. Whatever happened on that trail, it's not something I want to mess with again. I've been home for 2 days now, trying to make sense of what happened to me on the Appalachian Trail. My hands are still shaking as I type this, but I need to share my story. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Or maybe I'm just going crazy. Either way, I can't keep this to myself anymore. A week ago, I was just another hiker on the AT, doing a section in the Smokies. I'm 32, been hiking for years, never had any problems before. This was supposed to be a routine 5-day trek. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It started with the rocks. I was about 2 days into my hike when I came across these weird rock formations. At first, I thought they were cool. They were arranged in these perfect geometric patterns, like mathematically perfect triangles and hexagons. I'm talking precision that shouldn't exist in nature. I remember thinking it would make a great Instagram post, but then things got strange. My compass started going haywire, spinning like it was in a blender. I wasn't too worried at first. I figured it was just some magnetic rocks or something. I had my GPS anyway. Big help that turned out to be. That night, I started hearing the whispers. They weren't in any language I know, more like clicking sounds and weird humming. I told myself it was just the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I checked outside my tent, there was nothing there. Just those creepy rocks, almost seeming to glow in the moonlight. The next morning is when I realized I was in serious trouble. I packed up and started hiking, following my GPS. But after a few hours, I started seeing familiar landmarks, like this one dead tree that had fallen in a really specific way, and these white mushrooms growing in a spiral pattern. Then I found myself back at my old campsite. According to my GPS, I'd walked 12 miles, but somehow I was right back where I started. I tried different directions, different paths, even tried bushwhacking. Nothing worked. For 3 days, I kept ending up in the same 1-mile section of trail. My GPS showed I was making progress, showing new coordinates every time, but it was lying. I was going nowhere. The worst part was watching my supplies dwindle. I started rationing my food, but you can only stretch it so far. Thank God there was a stream nearby for water. But the whole time, those whispers kept getting louder, and the rocks. I swear they were moving when I wasn't looking. The patterns would be different every time I passed them. One morning, I woke up to find all my gear arranged in geometric patterns outside my tent. Everything, my cooking stuff, clothes, even my hiking poles. I hadn't heard a sound during the night. The last night was the worst. The rocks started glowing. Not like reflecting moonlight, actually glowing with this faint blue light pulsing in patterns. And the whispers. They weren't just noise anymore. I started understanding them. I don't want to talk about what they were saying. I still don't know how I got out. On what I think was the 4th day, I was following the stream for the 100th time, delirious from lack of sleep and food. Everything went dark for a moment, like someone had turned off the sun. When my vision cleared, I was standing on a different part of the trail. My GPS showed I was 15 miles from where I'd been, and this time it was real. I practically ran back to my car. The park rangers didn't believe me when I reported it. I mean, I don't blame them. It sounds insane. But here's the really messed up part. When I got home and checked my GPS data, it shows a completely normal hike. No loops, no backtracking. According to my GPS, I never spent more than a few hours in that section of trail. But I know what happened. The food missing from my pack proves it. The weight I lost proves it. And the nightmares. God, the nightmares prove it. I'm never hiking that section again. I can't even look at geometric patterns anymore without feeling sick. I tried to find those rock formations on satellite images, but that whole section just shows up as a blur. Has anyone else experienced anything like this in the Smokies? Or anywhere on the AT? I need to know I'm not crazy.